Hi, my name's Carrie Threadgill. I'm the Non-Game Wildlife Program Coordinator for our Wildlife and Freshwater Fisheries Division here in Alabama. I'm going to be talking about some of the basic wildlife principles that you need to know and some examples of those too. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I'll try to get through this pretty as quick as I can. So when we're talking about wildlife, the first thing to understand is the difference between what a wildlife is and also the difference between wildlife, domestic, and feral species. So, what is wildlife? These are the species that are exactly what they state. They're wild and that are not influenced by their relationships with humans. There are different types of wildlife. We'll look at the different taxa groups a little bit more in detail in just a minute. So, are these species wildlife? Are they considered wildlife? No, they are strongly influenced by their relationships with humans. So these species, such as cats, dogs, livestock, they're all considered domestic animals or domesticated. So would these be considered wildlife? Again, no. The horses, donkeys, and hogs that were once domesticated, but over time they have turned wild. So these would be considered feral animals. So they were once domesticated, but now live out in the wild. So one way that biologists such as myself, especially those that work for state and federal agencies, that distinguish between all wildlife species is two broad categories, looking at either game or non-game species. Game species are those species that have been traditionally harvested for several reasons, including food, their fur or other parts that are important for cultures, or other sport or cultural traditions. So those would be your quail and fur bearers, such as the beavers, and you have your deer and alligators and different animals. But then if you look at non-game species, those are species that are not hunted, just as their name states. So you would look at salamanders, um, any or woodpeckers, songbirds, different species such as that. When managing for wildlife, there are two main guiding principles to consider. Conservation is the wise use of natural resources, whereas preservation is the protection of lands and their resources from human use and maintaining those lands in a pristine form. Basically, preservation is the protection of land but leaving it alone, which is often the case in natural parks and wilderness areas. And conservation is the management of resources and multiple uses, such as recreation, hunting, hiking, etc., to allow people to enjoy those resources while still maintaining those sustainable populations, which is what we as a state agency do on our properties, as well as some federal agencies such as the U.S. Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management. So now going back and looking at the different taxa groups or the different groups of wildlife that we have, some unique features with mammals are that they are warm-blooded creatures, with almost all giving birth to giving live birth. There's one exception, that would be the duck-billed platypus that's pictured in the bottom right-hand corner, and they actually lay eggs. Mammals also have mammary glands, which are used to feed their young, and they're covered with hair. So they can be broken down into different groups as well. One large group of mammals is the ungulates. Um, these are kind of more of your big game species, but these ungulates are large mammals that are hoofed. So here in the middle you can see the different tracks that are some of the different hoof tracks that the deer and elk, antelope and bighorn sheep, things like that, that would be considered an ungulate. Another group of mammals is the fur bearers, and this includes animals such as the marten, the fisher, muskrats, foxes, river otters, bobcats, beavers. These have all traditionally been trapped or hunted for their fur. And this group can also include carnivores and rodents. So if you're looking at predators, This is another group of mammals, or how we can break them down. But predators are mammals that are built for speed. They have sharp teeth and claws. They use camouflage to hide so that they can actually catch prey and catch them off guard. And they have eyes on the front of their heads to help with catching their prey. So they have all of these different characteristics that are specific for how they function in the wild. So the next taxa group is the birds. And these are also warm-blooded animals, just like our mammals, and they typically lay eggs and have feathers. Another unique characteristic of birds is that they have hollow bones, and this adaptation allows birds to pick themselves up and fly easier because their bones are not heavy, which can weight them down and not allow them to pick themselves up and fly. One way to break down bird species, more of a broad category, into groups would be game birds versus non-game birds. They're just the same as how we do game animals versus non-game animals. We can break down birds into the same category. So we have our huntable species, and when we look at those, there's different species of quail, grouse, turkeys, ducks, rails, and pheasants, different things like that that would be considered game birds. And then we have our non-game species of birds, and this is a very diverse group of birds, just like the game birds is too. But this includes all of your songbirds, yellow-rumped warblers, cuckoos, house finches, all your hummingbirds, your eagles, the raptors, woodpeckers. So pretty much hummingbirds to eagles and everything in between. So birds tend to have specialized adaptations that help them with feeding on different items. One unique feature is the bills of different birds that can help you distinguish what type of food they're going to eat. Long, skinny bills are used for probing in the mud, and shallow water for invertebrates, or large, chunky bills that are used to crack harder seeds like cardinals and things like that. Raptors, for instance, they have a hook beak that they use, which helps them to tear their meat when they're eating, and they also have those large, strong talons that are used to grip their prey, especially when they grab something and try to fly off with it. They've got to have that strong grip. Fish-eating birds, they also have a unique adaptations where they're different types of bills. We've got those long pointed bills, kind of like the kingfisher, that are used for jabbing fish when they go underwater. There's the big net-like bills, like a pelican, that are used for scooping up fish scooping up water with fish inside, and that way they're able to filter and get the fish for them. And then there's those birds that have those strong, the long, thin legs, the waders, such as the herons and the egrets, they have to have those long legs for when they're wading through the water, shallow water, for food. And songbirds are the same. Their beaks are adapted to the food that they eat. And like I said before, the chunkier bills, like on a grosbeak or a cardinal, those are used for cracking seeds such as sunflower seeds. Those long, slender, delicate bills of the hummingbirds, they help them to eat nectar from feeders and also from those tubular shaped flowers that they like to eat from. And then those shorter pointed bills of the warblers, such as this prothonotary warbler, the yellow bird in the middle, those are used for them to grasp insects that they like to eat on. So then a third taxa group that we're looking at is the reptiles. These are actually cold-blooded animals. So they're not warm-blooded like our birds and our mammals. They are cold-blooded. But this means that their temperature is regulated by outside sources. So a lot of times you'll see reptiles such as snakes or lizards. They'll be out laying in the sun trying to warm themselves up on like a cool morning, or when it's a little bit chilly outside. They'll try to lay in the sun just to warm their bodies up. Most reptiles lay eggs. There are some snake species that give live birth. Rattlesnakes, such as the one pictured here, they actually do give birth to live babies and do not lay eggs. Um, Reptiles also have scales on their bodies, and they have lungs for breathing. Our amphibians is the fourth taxa group we're looking at, and these, like reptiles, are also cold-blooded, so they warm their body by the outside temperature, outside sources. So one way that an amphibian differs from a reptile, though, is that they have soft, moist skin. Also, one big thing about amphibians is that they have two different life stages. Amphibians are born in the water and have gills and tails when they're born, and then they undergo a metamorphosis to a land stage. So they're born in the water, and they have this metamorphosis while they're living in the water, to where they're able to live on land. And then they have that's when, after their lungs have formed for them to be able to breathe out of the water, and they also have grown legs and lost that tail that they originally had, like the tadpole here pictured. So amphibians are any of your salamanders and your frogs, and um, so especially with amphibians, but with all species, we'll talk in a minute. But the water quality is very important for our amphibians because of this two life stage that they have. They are reliant on those water sources to ensure that their offspring can survive. One water source that is not constant throughout the year but extremely important to amphibians is ephemeral ponds. These are small depressions that can be found in the forests, in the pastures, and other habitats. And they fill up with water during the winter and the spring when we have lots of heavy rains. And this is where we'll have frogs and salamanders that will migrate to these ponds at that time and lay their eggs. These water sources, they'll tend to dry up in the summer months after those eggs have hatched and those babies have grown up and changed into their life stage, their land stage. But these water sources, they'll dry up during the summer months, which is really important because um, those amphibians can't have any kind of fish in the ponds that they're laying their eggs, because if there was fish present, they would wipe out their eggs. They would eat them all. So these ephemeral ponds are really important because there's no fish present in them, because they dry up and they're not full of water the whole year, which would be something the fish would need, obviously. So there are some species that are purely aquatic as well. The picture on the bottom left here is an aquatic eastern hellbender, which is one of our largest salamanders that we have. They rely on clear flowing streams and have been really affected by things such as impounding of streams, channelization, sedimentation, and siltation. So they rely heavily on quality water sources or streams. One unique method that we as scientists have been able to use and try for surveying some of these imperiled species, such as the hellbender, and it's more of a newer technology as well, is called eDNA, or environmental DNA. And this is a way to detect the presence of certain species in an aquatic environment. So when an organism interacts with their environment, they shed tissue which contains their DNA. And in an aquatic animal, the DNA cells and tissues become free-floating in the water. When water samples are collected, filtered, and screened, then we can detect the presence of the DNA in those species that we're interested in looking at. So this is a great way to search larger areas for species that are nearly impossible to actually find and get our hands on. So it's just a unique research method that we use now. So what are 4 things that all living things need to survive? Food, water, shelter, and space. We'll go into each one of these into a little bit more detail and how different animals interact with each other. So the first one that is needed for every living animal is food. This is what provides their energy in the form of starches, sugar, fat, and cellulose, and it also is a source of nutrients and minerals that are needed for healthy development. So if you look at the picture, the diagram pictured here, this shows an example of food chain, which is a series of organisms and how one is dependent on the next as a food source. So looking down at the bottom where the plants are listed, you have those species that eat the plants, such as the rabbits, the squirrels, and insects. And then the next level would be those that eat those plant eating and that plant eating group. So that would be some birds and foxes and snakes and so forth up the chain. So it just shows how the arrows just show how one species is dependent on the other. So going back to the food chain, those species listed at the bottom that were the plant eaters, those would be considered the herbivores. There are different types of herbivores. Grazers, such as bison, they consume grasses by grazing in fields and pastures. Then next you have your browsers. Those could be deer, and they eat shrubs, leaves, small stems, and woody plants. And then they have the intermediate feeders, which eat everything from grasses to forbs and shrubs. And an example of that would be antelope. So who eats the herbivores? Carnivores are considered the meat eaters of the food chain, and they eat insects, birds, reptiles, mammals, any meat that is available pretty much. Wolves and coyotes would be considered some of the top animals on the food chain and some of the largest predatory meat eaters that we have. Also included in the food chain would be omnivores. They eat everything in sight. They eat berries, shrubs, fish, and mammals, so both plants and animals. And bears would be considered omnivores because they eat everything in sight. So water is our second resource that all creatures require. The animals can get their water from actual water sources, such as lakes and rivers and streams, but they can also get their water from foraging on plants that have that water in them already. In addition to the drinking water, though, water is important is an important resource for some animals that depend on the water sources for laying eggs, such as the amphibian species that I mentioned earlier. Shelter is the third requirement of all animals. So shelter is used as a protection from harsh climates and is also used as protection from predators. Some species have special adaptations that they use along with shelter to protect themselves from predators. Snowshoe hares, for example, they use camouflage along with shelter during the summer and winter for the protection from predators. They have a thick brown coat during the summertime to blend in with their surroundings, and then during the winter they grow a thick white coat to camouflage themselves in the snow. Because if they were brown during the winter, they'd obviously stick out like a sore thumb and be easy prey for any predator that was around. Pronghorn are another one that's they have unique coloration that allows them to live out in those wide open spaces, those wide open rangelands where they like to stay and blend in with their habitats. Space is the fourth requirement that all living things need, and this can be considered an animal's home range or the area that the animal uses for daily and yearly activities. A species' home range is dependent on their size and also their habitat quality. So, for example, a grizzly bear's home range is 10 to 380 square miles. They're obviously a much larger animal, so they require more space. While the gopher frog, for example, it only requires about a mile or less, but they're very small. If the quality of the habitat for the grizzly was high, which means that there's a lot of food resources available, water, shelter, all of the requirements that they need, then their home range may be on the lower end. So it would be closer to the 10 miles. But if their habitat is low, it has low quality, and they're having to travel greater distances to find food and to find shelter, then their habitat or their home range may be much larger. So it would be on that higher end of their range. And this is true for all animals. If they have to travel farther to find those resources that they need, then their home range size is going to be much larger. So what is habitat? This is the place that an organism lives. What makes good habitat? Like I said before, this is dependent on the species, but good habitat is an area that provides those key requirements for the species, such as the food, the water, the cover, and space. Also, another key to good habitat is the arrangement of the habitats, and this can very much be influenced by humans. One example of this would be if roads are going through an area. Roads tend to break up a habitat for certain species that can't cross the roads or that have a higher chance of getting hurt or getting hit when they're crossing roads. So that would be the arrangement of the habitats. When looking at habitats and wildlife, there are different broad categories of habitats that can include terrestrial, aquatic, and fossorial. Terrestrial habitats are land-based and can be anything from grasslands to forests to deserts. Uh, Aquatic habitats are obviously found in any body of water, so they can be as small as a puddle in the road and as large as the oceans. Fossorial habitats are underground habitats such as burrows or tunnels. Some example of fossorial species would be moles or prairie dogs that all live underground in elaborate tunnel systems. So when looking at species and their habitats, there are two broad categories of species that they can either be a generalist or a specialist species. A generalist species is a species such as a raccoon that can live in a wide variety of habitats, including human-dominated habitats such as attics or basements. Um, they, uh, they can pretty much live anywhere. Specialist species on the other end of the spectrum. These are species that have specialized habitat requirements, such as sage grouse, which require specific areas for breeding displays out west. So these species cannot live in just any type of habitat, like a forest or anywhere that's not specific to what they need, like a generalist or a generalist can. So a population is a group of organisms that belong to the same species and interact with each other. When you have several populations that are interacting with each other, that would be considered a community. If you look at the graphic I found online, there's on the left-hand side, you have an individual elk. So this would be an organism. But if you had a family together, then that would be a population of one species. And then if you look at the other species that interact and that live in that same area with the elk, such as bears, rabbits, birds, anything that's in that area, then that would be considered the community of organisms that are found in an area, in a habitat. So what is an ecosystem? An ecosystem is a community of those living organisms, like I said, in a community. So all the living organisms, but also it includes the non-living components of the environment that are interacting with that system. So an ecosystem is both the living organisms, such as the deer, the birds, the fish, and the non-living components, such as the soil and the water. An ecosystem can be any size, from a single lake and the species surrounding it, to a tree and the species that inhabit it, or to a complete forest patch. So what is a niche? A niche is the role that an individual plays in the ecosystem. This can be based on the type of food that they eat, how they obtain that food, when and how they reproduce and survive, and how they interact with each other. Each species niche is different, so it's impossible to maximize habitat for all wildlife. Managing for a few species may have adverse effects on another suite of species, so this would be considered trade-offs. And they're important when managing for multiple species, such as what we do in the state, managing for all species, or trying to manage for all species. Habits are considered actions that are done on a regular basis. Um, or when wildlife, they can be broken down into different categories, such as with respect to when they are most active during the day or their daily habits. Um, so when you're thinking about the time of day, a diurnal species is that species that is more active during the daylight hours. So that could be something like if we're just looking at birds. So yeah, for a diurnal species, that could be something like a eagle that is only active during the daylight hours. For a nocturnal species, these are the ones that are active at night, such as your owls, um, and they're out feeding at night. You're going to find them. You may find them during the day, but they would be sleeping most likely or resting. And then you have your crepuscular species, and those are more active during the twilight hours. So right before sunset and right before the daylight and sunset, like in the mornings and in the evenings. Snakes tend to be crepuscular. Woodcock, when we're looking at just birds, woodcock tend to be crepuscular. That's when you'll find them out and actually doing their breeding displays. Is right before it gets dark at night. So biodiversity can be described as the different organisms that are present in the world or in different habitats or ecosystems. Biodiversity can come in different levels. So with this graphic here on the right, it illustrates the different levels as well. When looking amongst populations, there can be biodiversity in the genetics of that individual species that causes each species or each individual in that species to look a little different. So they could be size differences, coloration differences, or have different patterns of coloration, or many other things that cause that genetic diversity. And then there can also be biodiversity amongst different species in a given habitat. And looking at an entire ecosystem and how they interact can be considered an ecosystem diversity. So looking at the different habitats that are found in an ecosystem and how they're diverse and how they interact. So when looking at those species and ecosystems, some habitats can be more diverse than others and have different biodiversity than another. This can all depend on the interspersion of habitats, which is how the landscape is laid out. So an example would be like what is pictured here with a stream running through a forest and a field. Those organisms that are present in the forest and the fields would interact with the organisms that are present in that stream. Other factors that can affect the biodiversity amongst ecosystems would be sunlight, soil, climate, topography, water, and vegetation that's present, and this can all affect that biodiversity. When looking at the biodiversity with ecosystems, more uniform habitats may not have as many species present as a diverse habitat. With a diversity of habitats present, like that previous picture, with the stream that was going through the forest and the grassland, there are many species that are found in those different habitats that would not be present in a single habitat, such as a solid grassland. You may find more generalist species in less optimal habitats than a specialist species, because generalists can adapt much easier to other habitats than a specialist that may require those unique features of a certain habitat that they're only found in. So when you're looking at how populations change in size and structure and why they change, this is considered population dynamics. As biologists and managers, it is important to understand these concepts of population dynamics to know how populations that we are managing for are affected. So here you have your births and your death rates. Obviously, it's the rate of how many births there are in a population versus how many die. So if your birth rate is greater than your death rate, then your populations are increasing. If the death rate is greater than your birth rate, then your populations are declining. Then looking at age structure, the distribution of various ages in a population, this can alter the population growth in a species. So if you have more younger species that are not reproducing yet, and your older groups have kind of like died off, then the population may not increase for a while. It may take a little while before you have that reproduction that would help to increase the population. Or if you have an older class that is not reproducing anymore, and then you may have a population that's declining because there's no reproduction. So age structure is important within a population. And then also sex ratio. So that's the ratio of the males and the females in a population. This can also alter the population growth and size. It's affected by your birth, your deaths, your immigration into a population, and your emigration, where animals move out of a population. And an even sex ratio creates a more stable population within a species. So with population dynamics, one concept that keeps the population in check is called carrying capacity. And this is the maximum population size of a species that the environment can sustain to keep indefinitely, which is set by Mother Nature, but it's based on habitat. Factors such as food, habitat, water, and other necessities available in the environment all can affect the carrying capacity of a species. So hunting, if you look here on the graph on the right, hunting is one management tool that we use as land managers to maintain that carrying capacity for species such as deer and turkey and other game species at a healthy level that is good for the population, but it also allows for hunting opportunities for the public. You can see on that graphic that if we did not allow hunting for some species, populations, they could become too large. Larger than the habitat can provide for. And this could cause increasing problems with disease, starvation among animals, and when the resources get depleted, increased predation risks from predators, and then other factors that would cause the population to become unhealthy if we did not use hunting to maintain those population levels at a sustainable level. There are many different ways that animals interact with each other that can also be beneficial or harmful. Some of the different interactions include mutualism, and this is when both species they benefit from each other. Pollinators are a good example of this. Whether it's a bee, a bird, or bat, they are benefiting from the food resources while also helping different plants to pollinate. Commensalism is where one species benefits but the other is unaffected. An example would be if with birds that benefit from large grazers such as bison or cattle. So when the bison or the cattle, they disturb the ground, that provides insects for those birds such as cattle egrets, which are often found in pastures following cows around. Antagonism is where one benefits while the other species is harmed. And this could be in the form of predation or in parasitism. One example is brood parasitism, which is pretty unique. And this is where the brown-headed cowbird, it's a little brown and black bird, it lays their eggs in the nests of other species and does not raise their own young. And when the cowbirds hatch, they often will outcompete the host species babies. And they can either push them out of a nest or they may try to kill them so that when the mama bird comes to feed them, that the mama is only feeding that cowbird and not her own babies. Amensalism is where one species is harmed and the other is unaffected. Algal blooms in the water are an example of this, as the algae can kill other fish and species in the water, but the algae itself does not benefit from it. Competition is where both species are harmed by competing for resources. This often happens when invasive species are introduced in an area. They begin competing for resources with native wildlife. An example of this would be with pythons in Florida. They are competing with native species in the Everglades, such as native snakes, for resources and out competing, really. Um, and then you have neutralism, which is where the interaction between the two species does not affect either one. This can occur when any two species live in an area and interact, but do not affect one another in any way, such as rabbits and deer that are found living on a grassland together. So there are many threats to our native populations that we have to manage for. One big problem that has grown bigger over the years is the threat of invasive animals. Invasive animals, as I mentioned previously, once introduced into an area, they may take over a species' niche or start competing with native wildlife for resources. This can harm our native wildlife in many ways. Some examples of common invasive species found throughout would be feral hogs and double-crested cormorants. Both of these species can destroy habitats once they're introduced and outcompete and push out native wildlife from areas. Invasive plants can also cause issues for native wildlife by taking over and outcompeting with native plant species that may be important food resources for wildlife species. Some examples of native plants out west that are starting to take over would be juniper trees and the introduction of an ornamental species such as the purple loosestrife that's outcompeting some of those native plant species that are more important for wildlife. Disease is also a big threat with native wildlife. Some that we continue to battle include brucellosis in bison and cattle and white nose syndrome in our native bats. Introductions of invasive species can also bring about new diseases to areas that have not seen them previously. Water quality issues can also harm a species' habitat and potentially cause disease or death. Some issues that may be easy to see, such as when water bodies have toxic chemicals that cause fish kills. Those are easier to identify because you see those dead animals in the water. Some issues with pesticide runoff or increasing nutrients in the water may not be as easy to see, but could cause harm to those fish and aquatic species, such as turtles, which could also cause increased problems up the food chain. Lack of oxygen in the water can also cause harm to fish and wildlife sources that are found in and around those body of waters. Uh, One thing to remember is that negative impacts and water quality issues can flow downstream from a site. So problems that can be can actually be more extensive than what they seem with regards to water quality and wildlife impacts, because you may focus on the site of the impact, but really you have to remember the entire stream downstream from that site could also be impacted and harmed. So while there are many other water quality indicator species such as mayflies and dragonfly nymphs and some of your smaller specimens, there are several wildlife species that can be considered water quality indicators, and they would be much easier to see. Um, Frogs and tadpoles, aquatic turtles, those can all be included as indicators. If they start to die off in a stream, then that could possibly mean there is some type of pollutant in the water. Also, large fish-eating birds such as osprey, herons, and egrets can then indicate if a system is healthy or not, based on it, if they are found feeding in an area or not. So this can all be considered the canary in a coal mine type theory, where if those certain species are not present, which might normally be in an area, then this could indicate some type of issue with the environment. So when you're looking at the water quality and the threats from water quality issues, specifically with contaminants in the water. Bioaccumulation is one factor that greatly affects species of wildlife as you move up the food chain. So this is a sequence of processes in an ecosystem by which higher concentrations of a particular chemical are reached in organisms higher up the food chain. So a great example of this would be the story of the decline of the eagles and osprey and other fish-eating birds. DDT pesticide runoff got into the rivers and streams. Then it was consumed by fish, and then it went up the chain to eagles and osprey and herons, and caused eggshell thinning, which led to their declining populations and led to them being listed on, or for eagles being listed on the endangered species list. So other obvious issues with water quality that would be considered would be pollution, sedimentation, and bacteria. Things such as oil spills can have a detrimental impact on water quality in an area, and any aquatic and wildlife resources that use that area, and areas downstream from the sites of the spill as well. So while there are many threats to wildlife, the biggest threat would have to be humans. With our population continuing to grow, development continuing to occur, this is creating habitat losses for wildlife and expansions of logging, mining, agriculture, changing the landscape. We're pushing those wildlife into areas that were once natural areas, and moving them more into those urbanized areas, causing human-wildlife interactions. Most of the time, these are negative interactions for wildlife. If there was no human influence on our wildlife populations, there would be self-regulation within our ecosystems that naturally occurred prior to human presence. Because of this huge impact on our native species, regulations and management efforts are put in place to help keep those populations from disappearing. Some of the management tools that are often used for managing wildlife on a state and even a federal level include hunting, which, as I stated previously, is a tremendous tool to help control and maintain those populations of species to levels that are sustainable given the habitat that is available to them. Habitat management is one of the best ways to manage for all populations because any action that we take on the ground is not only affecting those species that we might be concerned with initially, it affects all species that are found in that habitat or ecosystem. Habitat management can be anything from prescribed burning to planting and reclaiming habitat that have previously been altered, so pretty much anything in between. And reintroductions, they're also done when needed to help boost populations. One example, or a great example of this that helped to boost populations tremendously would be the reintroduction of the bald eagle. They were once decimated by the bioaccumulation of DDT, as I mentioned, and were placed on the endangered, threatened and endangered list. And then once DDT was banned, the population still wasn't really rebounding like it should have, and so we started in Alabama as well as across the U.S. Reintroduction programs started to bring birds back into areas in hopes that they would stay in those areas to start breeding and boost the populations. And now eagles are thriving across Alabama, across the U.S. And this is a great story, and they were also taken off the endangered species list because of that. So there have been many environmental policies which have been important to wildlife species all along the way. These are just a few of those important policies that have been passed to protect the wildlife populations. So we had the Multiple Use and Sustained Yield Act of 1960, and this one allowed for multiple use and the management of all renewable surface resources of the natural forest so that they are utilized in combination that best meets the needs of the people. The Wilderness Act of 1964 Congress and the Americans can designate wilderness areas that represent the nation's highest form of land protection. So this is more of a preservation type where there's no roads, no vehicles, or permanent structures allowed. And the Wild Free Roaming Horse and Burros Act of 1971 protects the wild horses and burros from capture, branding, harassment, and death. This is an integral part of natural systems of public lands out west. Some other environmental policies include the Endangered Species Act of 1973, which I mentioned. The bald eagle once was on. This was enacted to protect and recover those imperiled species and ecosystems upon which they depend. The Federal Land Management and Policy Act of 1976 requires the Bureau of Land Management to establish a planning process and accommodate multiple uses of land and its resources to achieve sustained yields of natural resources. And then the Clean Water Act of 1977 established a basic structure for regulating discharges of pollutants into waters of the U.S. and regulate quality standards for surface waters, which are truly important for a lot of species. So going a little bit more into detail with the threatened and endangered species. So the Endangered Species Act of 1973. Again, this act was passed to protect and recover imperiled species and those ecosystems which they depend on. There have been several monumental success stories since the act was passed, including the bald eagle that I mentioned, and also the gray wolf. The gray wolf is a controversial one, though, because the reintroduction of the wolf into some of those western states has caused more human interactions with wolves, and there have been some killing of livestock. So wolves are going into areas and taking livestock where other food sources may not be as readily available. And this has caused some major conflicts with farmers and ranchers out west. So it's a pretty unique system of trying to manage for this species that recovered or that has recovered, but also trying to keep them from causing too much of a human interaction and negative impact on human interaction and farmers out west. So with the Threatened and Endangered Species Act, there are different threat categories. The highest, obviously, is if a species is extinct, and this means that they are no longer in existence. Extirpated, as with something like with eagles. Eagles were extirpated from Alabama and from a lot of other states. This means that they went extinct from certain areas, but not across their range. So they still had a really good population, like down in South Florida. They had a really good population, strong population, but in Alabama they were completely extirpated. Endangered species is that species that is likely to become extinct and threatened are those that are vulnerable and likely to become endangered in the near future. There are also a couple of additional categories. Candidate species are just that. They are candidates for the endangered and threatened list because there's sufficient information on their status to propose them as either endangered or threatened, but the listing is precluded by other priority listing activities. So that means that there's just more pressing issues that are ahead of them, basically, in the list. And then reintroduction is the deliberate release of a species into the wild from captivity or relocation from other areas in the species range. So what we did with the eagles, we reintroduced eagles into Alabama that came from a different part of its range, so from Florida. We brought young eagles from Florida and released them into Alabama in a reintroduction effort. So while the Endangered Species Act and the Threatened and Endangered Species List is managed on the federal level, as a state, we also have regulations and protections for species on our state level. Some of the management we work on daily includes regulations on hunting seasons and bag limits to control the carrying capacity of those species, and habitat management work on state wildlife management areas to manage for all species present. Regulations also include protection of some species. So we have our state protected list that is a species of vulnerable species. It's a list of vulnerable species in the state that are illegal to possess, take, kill, harass, anything. So they're protected within the state. We also combat invasive species through habitat management, trapping, and regulations to try to protect our native wildlife to the best of our ability. So, why is hunting important? I already discussed the ecology of it and the fact that hunting is beneficial for maintaining our carrying capacity for those species hunted. But did you know that purchasing a hunting license also benefits other species? So our non-game wildlife program, which I coordinate, is funded through the purchases of wildlife and hunting, or of hunting and wildlife heritage licenses in the state. Many other states are funded similarly. So hunting licenses actually help to bring back the bald eagle, one of our largest success stories. With regards to regulations and management, both state and federal agencies help to regulate wildlife so that we do not have that overexploitation of any species and so we don't lose any species like we have in the past. There are some species that are considered federal trust species, and these would be your migratory bird species that migrate across the state, such as waterfowl, and migratory game birds, such as doves, as well as species on the threatened and endangered species list, marine mammals, and some other species of concern. And then on the state level, states decide on their own regulations with regards to those non-migratory species and species not considered under the federal trust, such as deer, elk, turkey, and those species. So invasive species control is one management tool that is implemented on both federal and state levels with regulations, enforcement, and management to try to prevent invasive species from coming into the United States, but also to maintain and regulate those species that have already been brought to the country. On the federal level, the Lacey Act does not allow for import, export, selling, acquiring, or purchasing of fish, wildlife, or plants that are taken, possessed, transported, or sold in violation of U.S. or Indian law or in interstate or foreign commerce. That's a mouthful. On the state level, states decide what species we deem to be prohibited for reasons such as health and safety issues, economic issues, or potential harm to native wildlife populations. One big example of issues that are caused by invasive wildlife is the introduction of the Burmese pythons into the Everglades. These snakes were brought to the U.S. in the pet trade and now have been intentionally or accidentally released into the wild in areas that have taken a hold of the Everglades. They're causing issues with native populations by outcompeting some of the native animals, and they're also wiping out populations of small mammals and other species. And in addition, they're introducing new parasites into some of our native snake species, which is harming those populations. So there's a lot of issues with when especially a large invasive species such as a Burmese python is introduced into a population. And they're slowly, if you look at the map, you can slowly see where they're starting to come up north some. So with increasing interactions between humans and wildlife, the future of wildlife really depends more so on the management of humans and educating them on how to live with wildlife more than on managing the species themselves. So we do a lot of human wildlife interaction issues, or we deal with a lot more, especially on a state level, a lot more calls from that human wildlife interaction that's negative than actually being able to manage the species themselves. I'd just like to end on one quote that I think anybody that goes into the wildlife field should really learn. We abuse land because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us. When we see land as a community in which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect. I think this is a great concept for anybody that's in wildlife management to learn. Thank you.